Kevin, we're back. It's been 3 months since our last attempt at doing this.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're much better this time around.
Yeah, I think we're good, man. I think we're pros now.
Yeah.
We got this.
Not quite, but there will be some improvement.
For sure. Awesome.
Okay, so today, I guess one of the topics that we kind of gone back and forth on in our conversations through Facebook and other methods is being selective with the kind of clients that you work with.
Yes.
And certain warning signs, triggers, red flags, whatever you want to call them, just things in general that can kind of give you a quick heads up as to what you're getting yourself into. Before we even get into it, a lot of photographers need to understand that it's okay to be selective. It's okay to turn down work. It's okay to say no.
Absolutely.
It's okay to ask questions. And I think a lot of photographers, especially when they're starting out, they just want to get work. Maybe they need the money. So I definitely don't want to be tone deaf to financial situations.
Sure.
So I guess if you need the money, it happens. But that's another topic that I'll just say on that you probably shouldn't be full-time as a photographer if you don't have, if you're not already making a good chunk of your income through photography.
That's true.
Just so you could avoid having to put yourself in those situations. And that's a topic for another discussion, but I just kind of wanted to keep that out there.
Yeah.
So we're going to assume that people listening already make a good chunk of their income from photography and aren't just struggling to get by.
Okay, cool. So we're going to cover some red flags then.
Yeah.
Identifying some red flags before you even jump into a project with a client, and things to look for so that you don't get yourself in a sticky situation, like you said. So what would you say, Christian, is the for you? What's the red flag that jumps out the most? Is there a particular situation that you found yourself in throughout your career the most?
Yeah, I would say the most common one is just a lack of information, a lack of forthcoming with information. So when you're negotiating on a bid or a job, I think you have to kind of adopt the persona of a detective. You got to get all the details up front. And a lot of times clients, they don't reveal those details. And I don't want to say that they're being malicious. A lot of times they're really not. They're just maybe they themselves don't know, or maybe they just didn't consider them. So it's your job to consider them. So things basic things like usage, final number of deliverables, final number of assets, how many rounds of revisions, what constitutes a revision. For example, if someone wants a change, where do you draw the limit between what they get and when you have to bill? So that matter when it comes to getting information. But other things this is a big one, is the completion of the project. You want to make sure you have a solid end date. Production will end at this date.
Absolutely.
Because what ends up happening is then clients, this has happened to me a few times, is that clients will very often, things happen on their end, budgets dry up, or they get other priorities. So all of a sudden your project is no longer as high a priority, or maybe they just can't get things scheduled. They can't get their assets or their personnel in order. Whatever the reason, it gets delayed. And before you know it, you're in 3 months go by and you're waiting to finish this project, and obviously you want to get paid for it, but you can't until you're done. So I've started including language in my contracts that solidify an end date, and then abbreviating it with terms such as if through no fault of my own the project is delayed indefinitely, X, Y, Z, whatever.
Right.
I can charge more for it, or at the very least, I can demand the full payment of the invoice before before proceeding, because otherwise, you end up waiting 6-7 months before you finally finish.
Right.
And so that just goes back to the main point. You just want to gather as much information up front. And the biggest red flag I can give you is a client who doesn't have the details, who doesn't have answers to these questions. And
that kind of sparks a question in my mind then too, is how are clients finding you? Because I think that also plays a huge role in how educated they are, and kind of like setting the expectations for what they can expect from you and your services. So, for example, on my site, and I think on yours as well, there's kind of a package and a description, and they can kind of fill out a form to tell you as much information as possible about their project. Right. And then from there you get a chance to contact them and then explain more detail about like what you can do. I think that really helps cut down on those red flag clients. And when I say red flag clients, I mean people who have unrealistic expectations, or they kind of spring on you this like last minute request, or maybe you've delivered some images and then they want an unlimited amount of revisions. And so I think that's so crucial to start from the very beginning of that workflow.
I know of other photographers who don't even have their phone numbers on their websites. And actually, I don't either, for that reason, because I hate getting ambushed by people. Like who, like you're often like on a job shooting, or Absolutely. You're driving, or you're just picking up your dry cleaning, and somebody calls you, and then they start like, well, how much is this going to cost? And you're like, wait a minute, man, like, I'm driving, I'm doing something, I gotta process this, and I need information, and a quote. It's like you walk into a mechanic and you tell them like, hey, my car's broken, how much is it going to cost to fix it? They're going to look at you like, I haven't even looked into the hood yet. Like, how would I know? So it's kind of like the same sentiment. So definitely, like, whatever you can up front to pre-qualify, like you mentioned earlier, absolutely do it. I think the questionnaire on your website is perfect.
That's really smart. I mean, if you think about it, it's classic pre-qualification, right? If they take the time to go and input the details needed and the time it takes to fill out the form, they're invested at least slightly enough to be serious about it. Exactly. Whereas opposed to other people who might just contact you, like DM you on Instagram or Facebook message you, and they're like, how much do you charge for a shoot? And it's kind of funny because I think that is a red flag, or that has been a red flag in the past for me, when someone just directly contacts you and just jumps right into that question, like how much do you charge for a shoot? It's such a loaded question that I found that a lot of those people often don't end up being the best fit for me because of that, very straight to the point nature. Yeah,
I would say, and any client, and I'll get back to that, but any client who like actively resists or like shows any type of frustration, like I've had some clients like, oh, why do I have to fill this out, or like, why do you need to know all these? Anybody who shows any kind of like, I don't want to say hostility, but definitely a resistance to those questions, I automatically just like disqualify them. I'm at the point now in my career that I just say thanks, but no thanks. I don't think we're a good fit.
Totally.
Because those are the people that, in my experience, end up wanting a lot more for a lot less. So.
Right. I mean, ultimately, that it really means that you can't put a price on your dignity as a creative professional, and even if the project in question is a lucrative one, you have to consider all of the kind of the hidden stress and anxiety and time that you have to spend to make that client happy. And some clients, they're very difficult to deal with, and you can kind of look for those red flags right from the start and identify them so that you don't put yourself in a situation that's going to be really challenging for you.
And again, like, I just want to reinforce that this isn't talking bad about people who are trying to stick to a budget. We all have budgets that we got to stick to. This is more about people who, I guess, are trying to cut costs at all costs. That to the point that you're going to end up losing money yourself, because the client, like, if you actually intend to produce something of quality, it's going to end up costing you a lot more time if the client isn't willing to, like, to give you the resources that you need. It's just one of those things, like, help me help you. How can I help you if, like, you're giving me nothing? Right.
Now, I want to speak real quick on a situation that happens a lot, that I think a lot of photographers have done this, and I think it's a mistake. So let's say a client comes to you and they give you the details of their project, and then they ask for a quote. So you give them a quote, and they immediately come back and say, hey, we really can't afford that. Can you do it for this instead? I think that it's a mistake to immediately just concede, or even just concede in general, and say, okay, fine, I'll go ahead and do it for that price. And first of all, before I even continue, like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you know anyone, any photographer or creative that, they just immediately go, okay, fine, I'll just do it for that price?
That the at least in my market, my market's full of people like that.
I think it's everywhere.
Nothing you can really, nothing you can really do about that. I guess it comes down to your own personal fortitude and your own personal valuation of what you're worth.
Right. Yep.
But and I mean, and if you don't, I guess if you don't have the stones to stand up for yourself in this industry, you're always going to get trampled.
Right.
But I would say that, though, to answer your question about concession, when a client makes it known, like, hey, we can only afford, if you say it's going to cost you $5,000 and a client comes back and says we can only afford $3,000, it comes down to several variables. So, like, how bad do you want to shoot this? So, like, if this is something that will look really good in your portfolio, you might consider conceding. But even then, I wouldn't just, like, outright say, like, okay, $3,000 it is. I would try to deduct a certain level of service.
That's exactly what I was getting at. Yep.
Yeah. Whether it's more restrictions on the use, whether it's a lower number of final deliverables,
right,
fewer revisions in post-production. Something's got to give. You can't just I don't know, just like
totally
give your time for nothing.
It's so important because I feel like if you just concede and if you just say, okay, I'll do it for the price that you say your budget is, it's kind of like, well shit, like, you were willing to do it for this much, but you're charging this much. In other words, it really kind of it conveys that you really were going after top dollar arbitrarily. And
also, you develop a reputation as somebody who can be lowballed.
Right.
Very, very frequently, you have to realize that your clients, and again, this isn't like they're not being malicious. They're just doing their jobs. Like, it is their job to get it for as low as they can without compromising, like, the quality they're seeking. So they're just, like, doing their job. So, they wouldn't be doing their job if they didn't like, maybe we can see if we can get it lower.
Right.
So a lot of times when they come back and say, can you do it for this much? They might just be seeing or testing or, qualifying to see if they could get it lower.
Absolutely.
It might not, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to end right there.
And I think a lot of people do think that. A lot of photographers do say, okay, well, this is the bottom line. But really, the art, there's an art to that negotiation. And it's so important to know what your services are worth so that you can kind of use it as a baseline if you do decide to take on the project for a lower rate.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a touchy situation that I've found myself in, is I've had potential leads call me and start trashing their current or previous photographer.
Oh, wow.
And they'll be like, we have a photographer, but he's X, Y, and Z, or he's lazy, or he doesn't pick up his calls, or he takes too long, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm never quite sure how I feel about that, but in my experience, I've learned to take that a little bit negatively, and not because I'm trying to defend the photographer, because look, sometimes some photographers, I'm doing my air quotes here, are very unprofessional, or they're amateurish, or a lot of times they just call themselves photographers and don't really know what they're doing because they bought a camera. So sometimes the photographer has earned his bad reputation, but the way I tend to look at it is like, all right, there's two sides to that. Yeah, maybe the photographer is bad, but also if the photographer is a professional and if he's making his rate, if the client is paying his rate, if the client is reasonable enough to work with, if the client is consistent, then there's really no reason to ghost or to stop communication or anything like that. So I often wonder to myself, like, is there more to the story? Like, is the photographer really unprofessional, or is the client just unreasonable to work with?
Right.
Or maybe it's a little bit of both. So without jumping to any conclusions, I would just say that, like, it should be something that you shouldn't make your decision based on that factor alone. But if you have that piece of information and there are other variables that cause you concern, you should probably want to reconsider whether you want to work with this client.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this applies to not even just professional environments, but people in general, right? If someone's trash talking someone else, it's generally a reflection of themselves and not necessarily that person. So like you said, the photographer in question could totally be someone that's, deserving almost of their lazy reputation or whatever. But yeah, you're right. If the client is like approaching you and then almost like starts the conversation with that, then you kind of wonder
that's what it is when they start like it's one thing once you've developed a rapport with the client and maybe like you've had a relationship and they things get a little bit more personal and they're like, yeah, we're so glad we found you because the last guy sucked.
Right.
Like that's one thing. But when they start the conversation almost that way, it almost comes off as like a gut, like them calling you is just a gut reaction on their part.
Right.
Which tells me like there's like a fresh wound, a fresh conflict, and they're just like, oh, you know what? I'm just gonna find someone else.
Right.
And I don't want to start any type of working relationship like that. It's almost like any type of relationship, right? Like you don't want to date somebody who's just like trying to stick it to like,
right. You don't want to be a rebound, and you don't want to deal with someone who's so fickle. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, take that with a grain of salt.
Gotcha. Yeah,
and,
for sure.
I mean, yeah, and look, there's at the end of the day, you're just dealing with people. So there are so many variables that we probably don't even have enough time to get to. But these are just kind of like some starting points. I would say that the most important one is still any type of reluctance to share information or any type of inconsistency in the information that you get. Like if you hear something from one person that you're talking to and something from someone else, it also could indicate that they're not in sync, that they don't tell each other everything.
Right.
And that can become very problematic because then you don't know like who am I listening to here? Who's my boss or who is making the final decision here that I have to listen to?
Yeah, totally.
That can get you in a dicey situation. And actually, in any kind of negotiation, really, like they always say, the person who's willing to walk away has all the power.
Absolutely.
Right? So
and sometimes you have to exercise that power.
Yeah, and I've done it. I've done it quite a few times recently, actually. And you know what? I don't regret it. I'm sure like there are times when I think to myself, man, I could have used that, those extra couple of $1,000s, but I also value my my emotional health. So
yep,
that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also, speaking on that note, it's there are different ways to measure value, and you can't necessarily like define your success by how much money you made. I mean, obviously money is a big part of it, but sometimes you're going to sacrifice the short-term monetary gain by taking on a project, but you might be better off because you kind of solidify your reputation as someone who knows their value and what they're worth. And so it's better to forego a project than take it on just to get some money. So how would you go about, letting a client know that it's not going to work or it's not the best fit? How do you do that without burning a bridge?
Well, okay, so once you've identified that, a certain project, a certain client just might not be the best fit for you, you have to remember that the person you're talking to is a separate entity from like maybe the brand or the agency or the company that's reaching out to you. So you don't just want to blow them off because that person might one day start their own agency, or they might go to another client, they might switch jobs. So people are going to remember how you treat them. I mean, I think every friends, how to make friends book says that, whatever.
Right.
So, so you don't just want to blow them off. What you want to do, you could do several things. What I tend to do is I just tend to give a quote that I know or I suspect they're going to say no to. So I quote everything very high. And most of the time, I just don't hear back from them.
Okay.
Or, if I do, they'll say like, oh, this is beyond our budget, thanks, but no thanks. And then, no harm is done.
Right.
I have yet to be put in a situation where they say yes. And if they were to do that, I would just have, and I was still uneasy about the feeling working with them. The money would definitely help, but I would definitely have clauses in my contract that are very strict and very specific as to like payment terms, and I would try to get as much of the payment up front as I could. So there's ways to still navigate that. And then, another thing you could do to just to get out of it is to just give like a very white, inoffensive lie and just say that the timelines don't match with your schedule. You'd love to do it, but unfortunately, you don't think you could dedicate the time that would require to make something great, to up to your standards. And no one's going to get offended by that. You're busy, you're booked. That's fine. So
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, one thing that I have done in the past is try to think of, colleagues or other photographers that might be able to handle the project that is in question. So, if you're not able to do it and you do know somebody that can do it, it helps to kind of give that client an option. Of course, it really depends on your network and who you know, but if you do know somebody, I think it's in good taste to say, hey, you might want to check this person out. They can help. They might be able to help you with what you're looking for, so that they have somewhere to go. I mean, at the bottom, at the end of the day, it's all of this kind of traces back to knowing your own worth, and it's up to you to determine what's going to be the best fit for you. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean monetary gain. Making those decisions, like passing on projects, might, hurt in the short term because you're not making the money that you otherwise would, but
Right.
in the long term, you're further establishing and solidifying your credibility and kind of reputation as a person who knows what they're worth. And speaking, and the other point I was going to make was, like you said, with if you view yourself as a consultant, you're really able to identify and get to the bottom of projects that you can take on versus the ones you can't. So it's easier for everybody. I mean, it's just more efficient when you ask the questions that need to be asked. And the way you do that is to position yourself in a way that you're there to help them, like you said. So it's not like you're just trying to extract, the most money possible and trying to do the least amount of work. It's like, hey, you're seeking out this solution. Here's what I can do to best help you, achieve that goal. So yeah, I think also taking that role helps you win more projects too, when people can see that you're on their side and you're just trying to help them solve their problem. So
Yeah, and yeah, I you know what? I can't summarize it better than that, man. That's perfect way. It's the perfect end to it all.
yeah, appreciate it, man. Yeah, I think this is a really good conversation. I think this is something that, not even just beginner photographers, but even seasoned photographers too, could benefit from just learning how to identify what the best fit is for them and when to take on certain projects, but also to kind of like exit gracefully if it's not in their best interest. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think I think I want to just reemphasize that point that we made, that it is okay to turn down work. You don't have to take every job that comes your way. Not every client is going to be a great fit for you, and that's okay. And
Absolutely.
Yeah, no shame in that.
Cool. Well, for those watching this episode now, I'd love to throw it to them and just, if you guys enjoyed this topic and if it's kind of sparked some questions in your mind, like, hey, what do I do in this situation? Not to say that we're know-it-alls, but I do think we have a lot to offer and some guidance for people who might want to better navigate the client world and, when to take on certain projects. So feel free to DM us or contact us and let us know if there's any particular topics that you want us to address in a future video, because I think this is really helpful. So.